I call to order the meeting of the panel on education. Since the last meeting, one information paper has been issued, which is the administration's written response dated 26th of June 2017 to the two letters from Mr. Kin-yuen and Mr. Hoi-dick, respectively, on issues relating to primary one admission system. And then item 2 on the agenda, priority measures to support quality education. Shall we invite the administration in?
好啦，咁啊，今日咧，我哋
Now, in relation to today's meeting, we're talking about a huge sum of allocation. I'd like to remind members that in accordance with Rule 83A of the Rules of Procedure, if there is any direct or indirect pecuniary interest in relation to the item discussed at the meeting, before you speak, please disclose the nature of the interest.
另外咧就我提醒
And I also remind members that this letter has been tabled, which is a letter to me from Mr. Horace Cheung urging the Finance Committee to expeditiously study the education funding allocation of $5 billion. So if today's item for discussion is endorsed and if members support submitting this item to the Finance Committee for funding application, then we urge the chairman of the Finance Committee to advance this item to the top of the agenda and also to study this item at the earliest meeting possible and to waive the notice, because the procedure is that advance notice of 6 days from the administration is required. So if we follow the normal procedure, we'd have to wait until next week. At the same time, we have received comments from teachers' organizations urging us to determine before the 15th of July this funding application. Deputy Chair. Madam Chair, I'd also like to comment on this suggestion because we're approaching summer recess. Much of the schoolwork has begun, especially in terms of preparing for the next semester. But because of this funding allocation proposal, there might be a slight delay and there could be some difficulties. If we can expeditiously deal with this issue at the Finance Committee, it will greatly help schools in terms of their preparation work. So I agree with Mr. Horace Cheung. I hope that if we endorse this funding proposal, this item can be discussed at the Finance Committee as early as possible. Any other comments from members? Yes. Well, it so happens that Mr. Chan Kin-po, Chairman of the Finance Committee, is here. So yes. Well, first, in relation to the shuffling of the agenda, I think that there is precedent, and if this is members' wish, I don't think there is any problem. But in terms of putting it to the top of the list, well, through decades, the electrical has never intervened with the administration's proposal. It's the proponent of the funding application who decides which to be put first. So I think that even if we agree, it will be up to the administration to propose advancing the item. All right, that's from Mr. Chan Kin-po. Any other comments on Mr. Horace Cheung's letter and the suggestions therein? Any comments? Yes, Secretary. Should we invite the Secretary to brief us on the paper? Well, if members support today's item to be submitted to the Finance Committee, we originally would like to follow the normal course of event in order to respect the Legislative Council. But since there is... Well, order, please. Order. Secretary is coming here the first time since he has assumed office at this term. So please, well, if there is such a strong wish, I'll go back and discuss with other colleagues, because some items don't fall under the purview of the Education Bureau. I need to discuss with the other bureaus first. Well, if there are no other comments, and if this item is endorsed by this panel, then we will write to the Chairman of the Finance Committee, Mr. Kin-yuen, in the name of the panel, to make this suggestion for his consideration. But it so happens that Mr. Kin-yuen is here anyway, so and he has already given his views on this matter. But I think that if we write to the Chairman, I think he'll be happy to accept it. Why the need to write a letter anyway? He said he would accept it anyway. I don't think we need to write a letter in the name of the panel.
係咁啊，邵家臻議員。
Mr. Shukachan, so you're suggesting that we don't need to write to him. All right, but shouldn't we express this wish, including this letter, as a matter of concluding remark to the Chairman of the Finance Committee? A conclusion, maybe. Well, this is a panel, not a committee. Mr. Lau Kok-fan. Well, I think they've heard, and I think that as a matter of formality, we can write to the Finance Committee. It's okay, because even after we verbally make the suggestion, it doesn't mean that we don't need to put it in writing. So I support that the letter be written. But it seems that we have different views on this matter. Deputy Chair, I don't think we should dwell on this point, because as long as this panel has a consensus, then when Madam Chair gives concluding remark at the end of the meeting, then we can just notify the administration, be it by way of a letter or by other means. Well, I think the crux of the matter is that we have a consensus. Mr. Kin-yuen, I'm here in the capacity of a member of this panel. So if there is a motion that is passed by the panel, I think that as a matter of formality, you should forward something to me in writing. As for shuffling of the agenda items, I think it's for the administration to process internally. All right, so we're just following the order of the meeting. But I've also received comments from a lot of members urging that the funding proposal be submitted to the Finance Committee as soon as possible, and also to advance the item at the Finance Committee so that we can examine the proposal as soon as possible, so as to facilitate the work of schools in the next semester, especially in terms of recruitment. And when I received these adaptations, I have also undertaken to bring in their views to the panel. But I think I also respect members' views as to whether a letter should be forwarded to the Finance Committee. So, apart from Mr. Shukachan, I don't know whether other members will be opposing to the idea of issuing a letter to the Finance Committee. So just very simply, let me ask this question. Yes? I don't think it's necessary. Mr. Ray Chan, all right. Well, if you are asking for our opinion, then I don't think it's necessary. Yes, Mr. Leung Kwok-hong. I think the issue is very simple. If you're suggesting that a letter be written to the Finance Committee in the name of the panel, you need to pass a resolution as a matter of formality, because this is an ad hoc suggestion and there may be divergent views. Dr. Lau Siu-lai, well, let's say if this is a resolution that we must vote on, I think that we should put it at the end of this item, because I think it's a waste of time if we further our discussion on this issue. We should be moving on to the proposal now. We can treat it as a motion moved without notice and put it at the end of the meeting. I've also received a motion from Mr. Horace Cheung. If there is opposition from members, he'd like to formally move a motion. Well, I didn't know the opinion of members, but since I've heard opposing views, I think that we should deal with a motion. Then we'll proceed with the motion before the end of the meeting. Now we invite the administration to, or rather secretary, to walk us through the paper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, the Chief Executive, before she was elected, met with the education sector, and in her election manifesto, she said that there would be recurrent expenditure on education by $5 billion a year, an increase to meet the resource needs in education. And the new term of the government has begun, and she introduced these measures in LegCo on the third day of the new government. And the main point is to raise the quality of education. And when we increase the number of posts in secondary and primary schools, it's to reassure the teachers and to raise the quality of education in the longer term. Now, firstly, this is different from the approach of one-off funding in the past few years. This is a recurrent initiative, and there has been discussion with the sector before we come up with these proposals. And after these last measures, there will be follow-up work. In the third paragraph of this document, there are the 8 measures. In tertiary education, there would be a non-means tested annual subsidy of $30,000 for eligible students pursuing full-time locally accredited local and non-local self-financing undergraduate programs in Hong Kong. And there would be provided a non-means tested annual subsidy of $5,000 for eligible students pursuing eligible undergraduate programs in the mainland. And there would be an increase in the in the teacher to class ratio for public sector primary and secondary schools, and this would be provided across the board to reduce the teaching load of staff and to also to resolve the issue, help resolve the issue in regard of the graduate posts, and all these would be graduate posts, in fact. And we would review to establish a professional ladder for primary and secondary school teachers, and so these posts would not count towards the calculation of promotion post entitlement. And also we would provide a recurrent cash grant to strengthen the staffing support on IT there would be $25,000 per school, and we would regularize the pilot project under the Community Care Fund by providing cash public sector ordinary primary and secondary school with an additional teacher post to facilitate the assignment of a designated teacher to take up the needs of special education students with special education needs. And there would be provided additional teaching staff, allied health staff, and resources to enhance support to students with in special schools. And in the kindergarten, we would provide annual adjustment of the portion on teacher salary in the subsidies under the free quality kindergarten education policy in line with the annual civil service pay adjustment. And we now have a 2-year tide-over grant. We would extend that for 3 more years to 2021-22 school year to ensure that the relevant kindergartens may retain their long-service teachers with higher salaries. And we would also use this period of time to review to see whether we can put in place a salary scale for kindergarten key teachers. We also, in this document, talk about the professional development, the professional ladder, and we would also see how we can upgrade, review the existing curriculum, and review the territory-wide system assessment and school-based assessment to promote vocational education to enter for students' diverse abilities and interests, and revisit the role and positioning of self-financing post-secondary institutions, clarify the Education Bureau's relationship with school sponsorship bodies and schools, and emphasize parent education and strengthen home school cooperation, and strengthen funding support for research for hostel development. So these are the 8 long-term development directions, and the increase. So the recurrent spending would be $3.6 billion out of the $5 billion promised by the CE, and for the remaining $1.4 billion, we would discuss with the sector and to see how we can use the money well. Now the 8 measures will increase 3,200 regular teaching posts, and there would be about 1,000 IT jobs created, and there would be 235 civil servant teaching posts, and the Education Bureau will also increase its staff by 22 if we receive the member support in this panel. We will table these proposals to the Finance Committee as soon as possible, with a view to obtaining the funding before the end of this year, of this legislative year, so that in September this year, these initiatives can be introduced to help the students and teachers. There are 16 members who are going to speak. Tan-Hei Chen, Hu Ka-chun, Hu Chi-fong, Xiu Lai. So altogether 16 members. Or Kun Chong, anyone else? Ho Chi Fong is number 10, so you are number 11. So you have to wait. Three minutes each. There's only one item of gender. We have about 1.5 hours left. So please feel free to speak. Tanya Chen. How about 4 minutes? Now, on tertiary education, I congratulate the Undersecretary, the former Undersecretary, for having been promoted to Secretary. Now, is it to $30,000? Whom does it really help? Does it help the schools? And some of the eight UGC funded institutions, they don't get any of this funding, do they? And how do you also make the distinction between local and non-local programs? And also on the second part, now it used to be funded by the Community Care Fund. Now, what is the logic for this $5,000? There isn't much justification in the document, and the newspapers say that if you pay the $30,000, then there would be an effect on the demand for the top-up degrees. Now, for mainland universities, we now have a means-tested program of $7,500 or $15,000 per family. Now, if they take some self-financed programs in Hong Kong, we provide them with a subsidy. So correspondingly, we provide a $5,000 study for studies in the mainland. Now, basically it's the same as the MUSSS, Mainland Universities Study Subsidy Scheme, except that there's no means test. And why is it that the 8 US UGC funded institutions are not included? There's a policy consideration. Now, the 8 institutions, they are subvented by the government. In the past, we allowed them to operate certain programs on a self-financing basis. Oh, please be succinct. You can continue. Perhaps I will answer later when this question is asked. Next, Leung Yu Chung. Just now, the Secretary kept emphasizing on how to spend the $5 billion. Now, there has been consultation with the sector that has been emphasized. Now, grassroots families and students' needs perhaps have not been fully reflected. So the $3.6 billion doesn't really help them that much. Now, the parents tell us that the financial needs of the students are not met when they attend school. So it should be 60% of the median household income, and there should be subsidies of 3/4 of the expenses. And some parents tell me that they don't have enough computers. For instance, only 2 computers per 3 children in the family. Now, 330,000 students would benefit. Now, so you subsidize the 15 non-UGC funded institutions, yet their programs are not popular. The enrollment is only 20% of what's targeted. Now maybe you subsidize the infrastructure spending, so you try to keep them afloat. Is that right? So
well, Madam Chair, very quickly, my answer to the first question is that in terms of the Internet Learning Support Grant, even if it's not covered in the 8 measures on this occasion, we'll consider it in the future, because the Chief Executive would like to come up with some short-term measures. And therefore, we'd like to proceed with the measures that can be implemented in the short term, but we'll consider other measures in the future. As for the 8 tertiary institutions, Madam Chair, if I may, I'd like to spend more than 4 minutes in explaining the issue, because other members may be asking the same questions later. When we consider the 8 universities, we considered the major function of the 8 universities, and that is they provide subsidized places, and they also take up research work. And in the sector, there is a clear delineation regarding self-financed courses and subsidized courses. For subsidized courses or UGC-funded courses, no cross-subsidization is allowed according to the UGC. So that means they should be financially independent. The subsidy should not be spent on self-financed courses. And there are still concerns or doubts in the community, but basically that is the situation. That is why we have not included the 8 universities. For the self-financed courses operated by the 8 universities, comparing to the courses run by the other post-secondary self-financed institutions under CAP 320, they are kind of different in nature. And these courses from the 2 groups do not follow the same system. So if we cover those universities as well, well, first of all, we need to consider whether without giving them subsidy, it will constitute unfairness. If we provide subsidy to the 8 universities' self-financed courses, then for subsidized courses and self-financed courses run by these 8 universities, in essence, they will be receiving subsidies from the government. So what is the positioning of these 8 universities? It takes time to clarify the position. But since we'd like to figure out in the longer term the different positioning of different institutions in operating self-financed courses, we don't consider it appropriate to provide subsidies for the self-financed courses operated by 8 UGC-funded universities. And in the short term, we hope to achieve something in relation to the positioning of the UGC-funded post-secondary institutions. That is, we'd like to clarify their respective roles and status of the self-financed institutions and the self-financed courses run by the 8 universities. And then we'd like to find out the difference between the self-financed programs operated by the 8 universities and those courses operated by the other post-secondary institutions under CAP 320. Before we decide in the future whether, after the review, the subsidy can be extended to cover self-financed courses operated by the 8 universities. But at the moment, we have yet to complete the review, and we don't consider it appropriate to cover these courses as well. Next, Mr. Dennis Kwok, followed by Mr. Lau Kok-fan and Mr. Charles Mok. Thank you, Madam Chair. The Civic Party is, as always, very concerned about any measure in relation to students with special educational needs. Now, you're going to regularize the project of SENCO, that is Special Educational Needs Coordinator. I want to know whether you're going to adopt the same starting salary of GM or ADSM as that adopted in the pilot project under CCF. If not, please explain. And also about teachers' responsible teaching post for providing support to SENCO and also allied health jobs. You mentioned that because of the complexity of the situation in SEN schools, the additional grant will be provided. I want to know how they would be allocated. And I'd like to know the conditions or terms of employment of allied health staff. As for increasing the ratio of allied professionals and students, will it also be covered under this allocation? Secretary. Well, the SENCO arrangement will be the same as that in the pilot project under the CCF. We're going to provide 1 GM and 1 APSM in a primary school, and with the additional teaching staff, the school can then appoint a suitable teacher who may be a schoolmaster or mistress, or who may be an experienced teacher to take up the role of SENCO. The objective is not to create the post especially for SENCO only, but that with the additional post created, the teacher taking up the role of SENCO will have his or her work burden shared. There is a suggestion I've heard that the SENCO post should be set at a level of, say, schoolmaster or mistress, such that a higher pay can be arranged. Now, so you're going to conduct a review later. So what about the more complex healthcare situation? Maybe I'll defer to my colleague to explain that. About the grant, the pay will be pegged to that of a nurse, and then the teaching assistants will be employed to assist her. Next, Mr. Lau Kok-fan, followed by Mr. Charles Mok. Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, may I congratulate Mr. Kin-yuen for your promotion. You're a suitable candidate. Please stay on and give more concern over the education aspect of our government. I support the increase of recurrent expenditure by $5 billion a year. I recall when I first joined LegCo, I asked a question about students obtaining the result of 3322, the DSE exam, and yet fail to get a subsidized place in universities. These students may in the end resort to self-finance programs, and this may pose a heavy financial burden on their families, and they may in the end choose not to further their studies. And it's really a pity, because in order to improve youth mobility, like the chief executive said, we must improve education so that they have better prospects. So I support your proposal to increase the subsidy or to provide the subsidy of $30,000 for eligible students. I think that the proposed measures are in line with our expectations. But let's say if we provide an annual subsidy of $30,000 for students taking up self-financed programs, I want to know whether there is any cap. For self-financed institutions, will the course fees be capped? Because otherwise, the Education Bureau may be offering a subsidy of $30,000 per student a year, but then those institutions may also increase their course fees correspondingly. And this would undermine the subsidy which aims at helping students. So I'd like to know whether the administration will monitor the situation. Secretary, I think many people are concerned about this. Yes, we understand that this is a widespread concern. First, in relation to the $30,000 subsidy, we have an understanding with the self-financed institutions. When we roll out the measure, we will sign agreements with them, which will clearly provide that the fee hikes must take into account inflation and CCPI. If it falls within the range, we'll accept it, because the $30 subsidy will also be adjusted according to the CCPI. However, if the fee hike for courses exceed the rate of inflation or CCPI, we will require further figures be provided, and we'll do a gatekeeping job. I think this will allay the concerns, because for the fees charged by these self-financed institutions, we know that the fees could be as high as over $100,000 a year. So if there is no cap imposed and there is no monitoring from the administration, then they may as well raise the fees to $100,000 to $200,000 a year. I think that signing agreements with them will provide some sort of guarantee for students. Next, Mr. Charles Mok, followed by Mrs. Regina Ip. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to ask about Annex C, providing or enhancing support, IT support to schools. Indeed, for IT support staff and teachers in school, very often they criticize the allocation, because the allocation received by schools may not go to the pockets of IT staff. They have low pay and they have limited prospects, and sometimes some schools may not even hire IT professionals, and instead the IT support will be provided by the teachers. So the grant will be set at $25,000 per month. Well, setting aside whether this is sufficient, I want to know whether this is flexible. Will schools be allowed to decide on the pay of technical support staff, and also whether the grant will be used especially for technical support staff, or just be used for any other purpose. And you also mentioned the creation of jobs, and IT personnel do not consider IT support staff at schools having very good prospects, because very often there is only one post with no promotional aspect. I want to know whether something will be done about it. And I've heard from the sector that this is a good initiative, because at least resources will be provided. But then we have entered another cycle, because for schools, many schools are still using XP, Office 2003, Windows 2003, etc. And we're lagging far behind technologically, not to mention cybersecurity issues. At the same time, many students are unable to gain experience in using the latest version of the software. So will the funds be used for upgrading the hardware as well? 3 questions. First, the grant is used for IT support staff at schools. So either the schools will recruit IT staff themselves or to find an IT contractor to provide the support. But manpower support, of course, is necessary. The grant is not for purchasing software or hardware. It's only for the provision of service. Is it on a reimbursement basis? After dispersing the grants, they will need to account for the utilization of the grant as to whether there is any promotional aspect. We understand the difficulty because if there is only one post per school, again, we agree that there is limited prospects, and therefore we keep it flexible. The schools can opt for an employee or a contractor. So I hope that you also take note of my third point, that we're lagging behind in terms of software and hardware, and more support should be provided. Mrs. Eugenia Yip, followed by Mr. Ray Chen.
Now I have a few questions. Firstly, the funding to the self-financing programs. Now, this will provide support for full-time locally accredited local and non-local self-financing undergraduate programs. Now, how many of these non-local programs and yet accredited programs are there? Now, there's SCAD right now, the art school, and there's another category. Some self-financing schools cooperate with non-local institutions to operate undergraduate programs, and these are accredited by the local accreditation authority. And there are not that many of these programs. If I remember correctly, there are less than 10. Can you provide the information after the meeting? Secondly, this subsidy, well, I saw in the newspapers that there is a Mr. Yuen Bokman. He is the chairman of the council of the self-financing school institutions with self-financing programs. Now, he made certain proposals. Now, do you actually pay the money to the student? Now, would it be better to pay the money to the student? And would they increase the school fees, all sorts of miscellaneous fees? How do you regulate them? Now, how does that differ from the voucher arrangement? Now, actually, we subsidize the eligible students to study under these eligible programs, and the money will go directly to the institutions. Now, the school makes an assessment of the number of eligible students enrolled, and that number is applied to us, and we pay based on the enrollment. So it's paid to the institution and not the student. So this Mr. Yuen, he is not happy with that. So I will ask later. So if they enroll more students, they get more. We want to subsidize the students to take these programs, but we pay the universities, pay these institutions so that they can take on the students. Now, Mrs. Carrie Lam says that she wants to proceed at full speed, and so this is really unprecedented. This is going to the Finance Committee, and then they're supposed to get the funding latest by Saturday. Now, you want to put this at the top of the agenda. Now, we don't have to tell the government what to do. Now, the Finance Committee can terminate the discussion of the items of if there are other items before this item. Now, this $30,000 non-means tested subsidy is actually payment of money to the public, irrespective of means. Now, in past debates, Mr. Law Chi-kwong said that the education is an investment. He said that there is a return, so this should be paid out universally, but they will not apply the universal approach to retirement protection. Now, people take risk. They hope that they can receive some protection when they age. Now, of course, I support this universal educational subsidy. Now, it affects the business prospects of the sub-degrees. Now, can you tell us whether you want eventually to abolish the sub-degrees? And you also have a non-means tested subsidy of $5,000 to those who study on the mainland. But how about those who study abroad? So, Secretary, I think mainly it's the last question, right? You just try to put it at the head of the agenda. Well, we'll try. Now, on the $5,000 subsidy, now this is this is a further development because we have a subsidy for those families whose students study on the mainland, now who had financial needs. So why is it that it's about the mainland this time? Because there is an agreement between the two governments. Now the mainland universities are willing to accept Hong Kong students who have grades of 3322 in the DSE, and they will not have to take the mainland university entrance exam. Now, I have reservations about whether this is a universal subsidy. Now, there are restrictions. Only those eligible would be subsidized. Some points have not been answered, but you can speak for ask in the second round. Now, the DAB and I myself both support very much this funding application. Now, the proposals cover kindergarten to tertiary institutions and special education, IT. I think it's quite comprehensive. In the past few months, we met with the education sector, and they, in the $3.6 billion funding request, this covers the urgent needs of the education sector as they have expressed. So this is praiseworthy. The government is well aware of the sector's difficulties, and it's well directed. Now, of course, some members do not praise the government, and yet, even though they criticize the government, so far they seem to be supportive. So I think the policy does meet with the public's aspirations, and there are several questions, however. Now you are applying for $3.6 billion. Now, how about the remaining $1.4 billion? Are you going to further consult the public or the sector? When are you going to come to us for that funding? Now, there is a 0.1 increase in the teacher-to-class ratio. Many school principals tell me that this is very timely, and would there be a further adjustment, further improvement in the future, so that we have higher quality education? The Secretary. Now, in the discussions by the CE with the education sector, she received many proposals or suggestions. Now, there are many proposals just on the teacher-to-class ratio and also on other issues. We will continue to discuss with the sector. And Mr. Leung Yu-chung said that we also have to consider the parents' perspectives. And so we will examine how we're going to spend the $1.4 billion. Right now, we have a long list of possibilities, but we haven't determined the priorities. We need longer time to determine where the consensus lies. And the CE has said that if there are worthwhile projects, she doesn't mind spending more than $5 billion. So it depends on how much consensus there is. On $1.4 billion, will you seek our views at the panel before you make any decisions about that? We will continue to discuss with the sector and with members on how to spend the $1.4 billion. Now, eventually, we have to come to the education panel and to the finance committee, and it will certainly be in the policy address and in the budget. So certainly it would come to members. Next, Kin-yuen and then Siu Ka-chun. We support very much this funding request. The new administration has heard the views of the sector before making these proposals, and it has respected the sector and taken on board their suggestions. I hope this approach can be continued. No, I don't think this is one-off. I hope it's not. Now, this approach will bring the government and the public closer. I think it's a very important and useful approach to listen and to the public. And there was a question by Mr. Cheung Kok Kwan. Now, the 0.1 increase in the teacher-to-class ratio. Now, the education sector hopes that this can be further improved. Now, is there space? Is there room for that? Is there a preliminary review on that? Now, there are quite a few questions. I will ask a couple more. Now, for the primary schools, there are some relatively small primary schools, and they ask if there are only 6 classes. Now, in the past, the impression is that the teacher-to-class ratio is relatively low compared to other schools. When other schools are 1 to 1.5, they are 1 to 1.4. 1.4. They were 1 to 1.4. So can they reach 1 to 1.16 like other schools? Also, Mr. Kwok mentioned about the Senko grade. Now, in the long term, the sector hopes that this can be a genuinely more senior post because it's difficult to coordinate when you are at a low grade. Now, the subsidy is to help the school to resolve the funding for the Senko post. But still, we hope that it can be confirmed that this could be a post to be promoted to. Now, on the primary schools with 6 classes, now the teacher to student ratio is 1 to 1.5. So when there's an increase of 0.1, there would be an increase in the in the number of permanent teacher posts. Now, we'll consider the point about Senko. Can there be further enhancement? We will take into account the suggestions. Now, we still have to try to gain a consensus on the priorities, so this will take more time and it won't be easy because there are measures for all types of institutions now later, but it might take more time for discussion.
But we'll continue to keep all options open and continue to engage the sector and the public in our consultation so as to forge a consensus earlier and to implement the proposals earlier. Mr. Shuka-chun, followed by Mr. Ted Hui. Thank you, Madam Chair. I need to declare interest first. I work in one of the 8 institutions as a teaching staff. I'd like to pick up on Mr. Kin-yuen's point. Just now, Mr. Kin-yuen also agreed that the administration consulted the sector on the proposed measures. I think it's a good move. We hope to set a good example. And I want to know how much consultation has been done by you or the chief executive, and what is a list of organizations consulted, because I'd really like to make this a showcase to set a precedent of good practice. But I also wanted to point out that apart from the education profession, parents associations, students associations, especially students from needy families, they are also relevant. I'm just concerned that in the administration's consultation exercise, students from needy families may have been neglected, and I find this regrettable. About this funding application, I'd like to make this point. For needy students, they have a lot of learning needs. They have come to the LegCo to stage protests, and there have been surveys reflecting the issues, such as the internet fees and the computers, etc. And for the $3.6 billion funding on this occasion, this is not covered. I hope that in the future some measures can be implemented to cover the point I raised, and I'm going to move a motion on including subsidies for needy students to pay for their internet connection fees and the purchase of computers. Any views, Secretary? I understand that before the chief executive has assumed her post, she met with representatives from the education sector, some school principals, and also met with representatives from the 8 tertiary institutions and other post-secondary institutions. And also the election members from the post-secondary education sector. So there were direct dialogues with them. And we have also met with different sectors such as the kindergarten, primary, secondary education sector, and self-financed post-secondary education sector. This morning I just met with some of the representatives, and we're still in the course of communicating with other representatives. We're going to do more in the future as for needy students and their needs. Of course, this is something that we'll take into account. But I'm afraid for the first batch of measures, they're not included. And we believe that it will be difficult to add this category immediately, because we're talking about the priorities according to different sectors and different groups, and there may not be a consensus forged in the sector if we put priority on this category. I appreciate Mr. Shill's concern. He is voicing out for the needy students, but to add this category now in the proposed measures may be difficult in our view. Well, Madam Chair, I want to ask for a list of organizations that have been that were covered in the consultation exercise. For the deputations that I met with, I'm happy to provide a list. As for the Chief Executive, I need to ask for those records first. So I think that at least there should be some record kept by the Education Bureau, and please provide a record to us. Next, Mr. Ted Hui, followed by Mr. Nathan Law. I need to declare an interest. I may be benefiting from the proposed measures because I'm a parent of a child studying under the free quality education kindergarten education policy. Now, about the eligible students obtaining $30,000 subsidy a year, their burden will be lifted, and there will also be measures to improve primary and secondary education, and measures to improve the pay of kindergarten teachers. These measures have come a bit too late because they have been long-standing aspirations of the sector, but being late is better than nothing. But we need to bear in mind that for the $3.6 billion funding, kindergarten is not included. There is a measure to adjust the kindergarten teachers' pay in accordance with the civil service pay adjustment, and also the 2-year tide-over grant. Well, these two are not really part of the $3.6 billion. So does it mean that the kindergarten sector is being neglected? I understand that we would like to formulate a pay scale for kindergarten teachers, but unfortunately this has yet to be done. Still, there are other things you can do. For example, fully subsidized whole-day places for kindergartens. It seems to be the missing link. It's not included in your proposed measures. There are also other issues. For example, rent hikes for some kindergartens and sustainability of the operation of some kindergartens. It seems that these issues are neglected. Does it mean that you're not attaching equal importance to kindergarten education? The government attaches great importance to kindergarten education. In 2017-18 school year, for the kindergarten education sector, an additional funding of $2.7 billion will be provided. That's outside these proposed measures, because the free quality kindergarten education policy will be introduced in the 2017-18 school year. So since $2.7 billion funding has been allocated, we need to consider this additional funding when we drew up the measures. About the other requests from the sector, about the kindergarten's teachers' pay scale, we need more time to consider all the relevant factors. As we explained, we are going to explore the feasibility of a salary scale. But meanwhile, we have already undertaken to improve the teacher's salary by two measures. That is, first of all, to peg the adjustment with the annual civil service pay adjustment, and the 2-year tide-over grant will be extended to 5 years, and that amounts to some $700 million. We'll be applying for funding with the Finance Committee, and the $700 million will not be counted towards the $5 billion recurrent funding, because this is a one-off instead of a recurrent plan. As for the whole day and long whole day places, we discussed the issue before. When it comes to free quality kindergarten education policy, we already explained that after 2 or 3 years of its implementation, we'll conduct a review. And in the review, we will look at the situation by then, such as rent and also whole day, long whole day places. So we need to implement the policy for 2 or 3 years first before we gauge the impact on the sector. What about the $1.4 billion outstanding? Will kindergartens be included? Madam Chair, I don't think this is how funds are allocated. For the $1.4 billion, we need to make reference to the list of requests and see what consensus can be drawn with the sector. Next, Mr. Nathan Law, followed by Dr. Lau Siu Lai. Thank you, Madam Chair. The government has increased recurrent funding for the education sector. It is good, but then I think that this is only to make up for the shortfall. Since 1997, government spending on education has been on the decline, and education spending accounts for a percentage of the total GDP, which is much less than other advanced economies. We're happy to see that more resources will be provided, but this is just about making up for the shortfall to raise the spending to a reasonable level. And we see that the funding will be allocated on hardware mostly. For example, teacher-to-class ratio will be increased, and other parts of hardware. In terms of software, I can't see anywhere in the paper how the government will address the issue, including pressure on teachers and students, and also different kinds of pressure facing teachers. I hope that the administration can come up with more measures to deal with the software of the sector. And for needy students and underprivileged students, I don't think that there is any special help for them. You take a rather general approach. But as many grassroots organizations have pointed out, needy students need extra help in, say, buying computers. And I hope that for the outstanding $1.4 billion not yet allocated, you can do something about that. As for subsidizing the self-financed institutions with $30,000 per student, in effect, you are subsidizing the students to take up self-financed programs in subsidized or UGC-funded institutions. Do you agree? And second point, in terms of monitoring, the administration is in fact indirectly subsidizing the funded institutions. Will you step up monitoring, or will you just adhere to the establishing existing method? As for increasing the teacher-to-class ratio by 0.1, do you have a target to meet? Secretary. As I mentioned just now, in the consultation exercise, the chief executive met with the head of the 8 institutions. So I think that the issues have been fully discussed. On monitoring the self-financed institutions, we follow the established mechanism and the existing regulatory framework. But as mentioned in paragraph 5 of the paper, when we explore the role and functions of the institutions, where a change of role and positioning is needed and a different monitoring approach is needed, we'll be happy to make changes to tie in with the change of the role and positioning of the institutions. This is something that we're happy to do. As for TC ratio, teacher-to-class ratio, we've heard proposals about increasing the ratio by 0.3 instead of 0.1. At present, we do not have a target in mind, but I believe that we understand that this is the aspiration from the primary and secondary education. Dr. Lau Siu Lai. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to follow up on Mrs. Ip's point on the subsidy provided to eligible students. I need to declare interest first. I am a teaching staff in a self-finance sub-degree or institution operating a sub-degree course. I won't be affected. I just want to know the mindset of the administration, because for eligible students, that is with DSE result of 3322 who fail to get a subsidized place, there are different pathways. They can take up a self-finance course in a UGC-funded institution, or they can study a 2-year sub-degree course for a top-up degree in the 8 institutions. Well, it is true that for self-finance programs in other post-secondary institutions, they have a quality issue, whereas for the top sub-degree courses, they are relatively more reliable. And in fact, this measure will cause a major disruption to the ecology of the tertiary institutions, because $30,000 is a substantial amount. The students would rather opt for self-finance programs in the institutions rather than sub-degree programs, so that there will be a disruption to the ecology of the post-secondary institutions, and the weaker ones will be phased out.
Because the sub-degree programs are quite popular, and the UGC funded institutions quite welcome these sub-degree graduates to enter their 3rd and 4th years. So during the transitional period, you should subsidize also the self-financing programs among the 8 UGC-funded institutions. So in a few years, when you conduct a review, you determine what the long-term policy would be. I think that would be more reasonable. Let me explain. Now, our package of proposals take into account the fact that some qualified students, because there weren't enough UGC-funded places, they then studied under some self-financing programs, and they felt a lot of financial pressure. So we try to provide subsidy for these students in the current proposal. So we do not plan to extend the subsidy to sub-degree programs. So those who complete sub-degree programs, and then if they then take certain top-up programs, we also pay to them the $30,000. So if they study under self-financing undergraduate programs, they are eligible to apply for the $30,000 when they met the initial 3322 requirement. Now, why don't you just provide the funding to the student? Now, as long as they meet the 3322 requirement, Now, because these sub-degrees have the goal of trying to let people move on to the UGC institutions. Helena Wong, we welcome the government support for those who are qualified for university but have a need for financial assistance. Now, $30,000 is for the institutions who manage to enroll the students. Now, a situation arising is that the students are afraid that they wouldn't be accepted by a program or institution, so they apply to several institutions. They don't know whether they would be accepted by UGC funded institution, so they apply to other institutions as well, and they have to pay fees to apply, sometimes up to $5,000. Now, if you are accepted, you are refunded, but if you are not, you don't get any refund. So the money is paid to the institution, so they would compete for students, so they will be even more reluctant to refund the application fees. So can you tell the institutions to come up with an arrangement to refund the application fees? Now, you charge them $5,000, they don't go to institution A, they go to institution B, and they lose the application fee. So you can deduct the administration cost, but you shouldn't deduct the entire application fee. Now, the student pays $5,000 to institutions A and B. How we pay the $30,000 is dependent on which institution the student eventually attends. Now, on application fee, perhaps Mr. Low can speak on that. Now, you pay them $30,000. If they are deducted $5,000 and could not get any refund, then they are only left with $25,000. That wouldn't happen because the $30,000 is paid to the institution where the university eventually studies at. Now, all along, we have been discussing with the self-financing institutions on the so-called reservation fee. We hope that there will be a uniform arrangement. We want the fund sum to be lower to a reasonable level, and we hope that there would be an enrollment date that's uniform, so there wouldn't be this competition for students. Next, Ho Kai Ming, and then Priscilla Leung. Now, we welcome the Education Bureau's policy. Now, it relieves the teachers, the pressure that teachers work under, and yet the laboratory technicians are not helped. Now, the IT staff receive some assistance, but for laboratory technicians, the parameters have been modified, so there would be a deduction by 100 for the entire sector. So the laboratory technicians help the teachers and to ensure safety of the students, because there is hazard in the laboratories. Now, we have just received the latest figures, can you freeze the situation, the numbers, because you increase the number of IT staff, but you reduce the number of lab technicians. In some schools, it's a reduction from 3 to 2. The secretary. Now on laboratory technicians, the new method of calculation has taken into account the latest developments at the schools. So actually, we try to increase the number. However, the number of lab sessions has decreased, or maybe it's a decrease in the number of students who take science subjects that have lab sessions. And in the review over the past couple of years, we have taken into account the latest developments, and we have taken into account the manpower requirements for the STEM subjects. So in the near future, we will not conduct a new review. We will follow the existing establishment pattern. Now, when there is a decrease in the number of positions, of course, some serving staff will be affected. Now, we are discussing this internally to see how we can help these lab technicians whose jobs have been phased out. But for the next couple of years, the establishment has been frozen. Priscilla, I teach at CityU. I declare that. Now you apply for $3.6 billion of educational subsidy. We support this. However, there are all sorts of problems in the education in Hong Kong. Now, this may just be a Panadol, a painkiller. Now, for those who are going to enter second year, will they be subsidized? Now, they are not the new entrants. Now, when you conduct a new consultation exercise, what's the scope? Now, you need to resolve the short-term issues like short-term teachers becoming permanent. Now, you need to consult the parents, the stakeholders, and future employers, whether it's self-financing institutions, primary or secondary schools. Now, how will you spend the money? Let's not just talk about the software. You have IT subsidies, but on the direction for secondary schools, can the resources be supplied to certain schools with certain strengths? For instance, a school that excels in astronomy was closed down. Now, these schools with special strengths at the secondary schools, could they be helped? And also on the curriculum, on the teachers' quality, now on the teaching methods. Now, can you have more audiovisual content in the teaching materials so that the students enjoy the subjects? How can you improve the mode of testing or exams, or instead of just adding to the curriculum? And the mindset of the teachers, how do you upgrade the quality of the teachers You have only several seconds left, Mr. Secretary. For those who are studying in qualifying self-financing programs, whether it's second or third year, they will also receive the subsidy. Now, the member talked about some very long-term issues. Now, in paragraph 5 of the document, a lot of that is covered. Now, when we discuss these issues, we will consult the stakeholders now on how much is to be spent on which item. And now it's difficult to have a comprehensive consultation on every item. Now, on those items where money is going to be spent, I'm sure the members of the legislature will be able to express their views. And also to consult the employers. Next, Chen Chung-tai and then Leung Kwok-hong. The government is going to pay out money to resolve various educational issues, but I am not happy that now this is a subsidy to the self-financing institutions. It's not helping the low-income families.
You're just subsidizing these private institutions. So call a spade a spade. Another question, because the Secretary hasn't made it clear in the paper. For these post-secondary institutions operating self-finance programs, can they enroll non-local students? Secretary. Madam Chair, about the $30,000 non-means tested annual subsidy, as we explained just now, administrative speaking, ultimately the money goes to the institutions, but this will lessen the burden of students in paying fees. Let's say if a student used to pay $50,000 as course fee, the government will be subsidizing the $50,000 by $30,000. I understand that, so the cost, or the education cost, will be lowered. But the point is, for the self-finance institutions, will they be able to enroll non-local students? I'm coming to that, Madam Chair. For these programs, they can enroll non-local students, but they will not be eligible for the $30,000 subsidy from the government because it's only applicable to local students. Why haven't you make it clear in the paper? Because if you're subsidizing the institutions, as to how these institutions will utilize the $30,000, you should make it clear that eligible students means Hong Kong permanent residents. Yes. In the paper, you did not put down Hong Kong permanent residents. So please clarify, Secretary. You mean to say Hong Kong permanent residents? Now, in the paper, we made it clear that the student should be taking the Hong Kong DSE with and obtain the 3322 qualification. It says here that for some students, they must attain 3322 in the Hong Kong DSE, and there is also another category with some sub-degree qualifications. Well, I think we can further clarify the point, but in short, I can say that definitely local students only. Next, Mr. Leung Kwok-hong, followed by Mr. Martin Liao. Yes. During the election and after as Carrie Lam became the C-elect, she consulted the education sector, canvassing support. And last time, C.Y. Leung, right after he was elected, came up with this proposal to dish out money. That is the old age living allowance. The only difference was that we were not happy that with the meager amount, and last time there was opposition. DAB proposed $500,000 and the Liberal Party proposed $300,000 as the income and asset limit. Well, if the proposal has come too hastily, we need to the council members need to study very carefully. $1.1 billion, which is the largest proportion of the measures, for subsidizing eligible students, each $30,000. You provide this subsidy because these students are eligible for UGC-funded programs. And you have been criticized for many years. You're now providing an annual subsidy of $30,000. I'm not going to object to that. But the problem is you have not increased the number of places, meaning that you have the same number of places, only that some students are forced to take up programs of lesser quality. So you're providing subsidy for them, but the ultimate question is whether you increase the number of places. Secretary, if Mr. Leung Kwok-hong is referring to undergraduate places subsidized or funded by the UGC, yes, in the short term, we're not going to increase the number of places. So unless more courses or programs are operated by the institutions to absorb these students, if you provide subsidy to these students to take up these programs, you're not really providing more resources. Well, last time the proposal to dish out money did not involve any vested interest, but now you will bring about an increase of 3,200 permanent teaching posts, 87 allied health jobs, 1,000 IT personnel, and some civil servants posts. That means you are providing an incentive to lure people support. Definitely, the teachers' associations will support that, and your proposal is so different from the sweetener last time. I am not going to support you for sure because I need to read the papers very carefully first. If you consulted the Teachers Association, of course they'll support you because you're creating more permanent teaching posts. But the point is whether the resources are used in a reasonable manner, whether the resources are sufficient. I need to consider the proposal very carefully. All right, your view has been heard. First round, we still have Dr. Fernando Cheung and Ms. Claudia Mo. Mr. Martin Liao isn't here now. Dr. Fernando Cheung, is he here? No. Ms. Claudia Mo. 3 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that if this can be solved by paying money, then it is not a problem. But when it comes to education, the administration is dishing out so much money. The administration is spending $5 billion on education, or is it 3.6? All right, $3.6 billion as set out in the paper. What about the outstanding $1.4 billion? How will it be spent? Please answer this question first. I believe the question has been asked, but you didn't have time to answer just now. Secretary. At the moment, we have not anything in mind because we're still receiving suggestions and we are still contemplating these suggestions and we're trying to get as much consensus as possible. It may not be unanimous, but at least we should strive to forge consensus. What about EM students learning Chinese or SEN students? Yes, we have received suggestions on these issues as well. About the money following the user, I'd like to pick up on this point. I think it's better to provide subsidy to students directly rather than allocating the subsidy to institutions, because like Dr. Helena Wong said, there is a concern that it will become something like a business operation and it will be vulgar. What's the difficulty in dispersing subsidy to users directly? If you're concerned about the education sector becoming more of a business nature, if we provide subsidy directly to students, it may even exacerbate the problem. According to research, if we adopt a money follow the user approach, we are relying on the force of the market to phase out institutions which are less popular. So if you are concerned that it may become too commercial and that the institutions will go after money only, then taking the money follow the user approach may exacerbate the situation. So we're not going to consider that. But on the other hand, will you consider only providing the subsidy if the student has been enrolled? But let's say if you take the money follows the user approach, then as long as you have the 3322 qualifications, then does it mean that if the student chooses not to further the study, the government can save some money? It's not about money, I'm afraid. As long as the student is eligible to be enrolled in such programs, the government is willing to provide the subsidy. So saving money is not the government's consideration. Any members here who have yet to speak for the first round? If not, then we move on to the second round. 6 members: Tanya Chan, Regina Ip, Kin-yuen, Shu Ka-chun, Helena Wong, and Cheng Chung Tai. Any other members who would like to speak for the second round? If not, then I'll draw a line here. Ms. Tanya Chan, please. 3 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry, there was another meeting on the third runway system, so I was at that meeting as well. So do you mind finishing your answer just now? You mentioned $5,000. I don't quite understand. I don't know whether other members have picked up on this point. What is the major reason for differentiating the self-finance and non-self-finance courses, and what is the impact on sub-degree courses? Because for students, they need to attain 3322 DSE qualification in order to be enrolled in a self-finance undergraduate program. But if they take the other route, they may not be eligible for the $30,000 subsidy. So when are you going to review the sub-degree or associate degree system, and will it continue to exist? Do you have any direction in mind? Secretary, I explained the 8 tertiary institutions and the other institutions, and let me explain the impact on associate degree programs. Our measure is to subsidize self-finance undergraduate programs. For sub-degree programs, then these students must at least attain 5.2 qualifications. And some students may opt for sub-degree programs with a qualification of 3322. So if we're talking about the impact, then we may be talking about students with 3322 qualifications who have chosen to take up a sub-degree course instead of an undergraduate self-finance course. But we don't believe that these students would turn to the other path immediately, because the students may have taken into account their interests, their prospects. So there may still be some students with 3322 DSE qualifications opting for the sub-degree programs. There may be a slight impact on the sub-degree programs, but I wouldn't say that it would totally stifle the sub-degree programs. What about the top-up degrees of the 8 institutions? They're not covered under the 30,000 subsidy measure. Let's say if a student takes up a sub-degree program and then be articulated to a senior place in the UGC-funded 8 institutions, then they'll be funded by the government. But if the student studies in a self-financed course operated by the self-financed institutions, and the student will not be eligible for the $30,000. Mrs. Regina Yip. I agree with Dr. Lau Siu Lai, having heard members' comments, that there will be a major impact on the tertiary education sector if you provide a subsidy in such a manner, because many students would be opting for the self-financed programs in the institutions for the sake of the $30,000 subsidy. What about the higher diploma programs? I think previously you submitted a paper suggesting that the sub-degree programs will be phased out, and you are accelerating the end of sub-degree programs. But it is also the government's policy to promote vocational education, because we have a manpower mismatch. According to many employers, they would like to hire somebody with a high diploma qualification, but many students have degrees instead.
In June, the Census and Statistics Department released the General Household Survey results, and they point out that if you classify by education, now if you take university for 5 years, you have a higher salary by 80%, by 8%. Now, Professor Yip Siu Fai at University of Hong Kong said that many employers don't require employees with higher education. They would rather pay lower salaries. I'm sure your proposals would pass today, but the Education Bureau should do some serious tracing study. Now, for those who take sub-degree programs, what would be their future so if nobody takes the higher dip because of this program, then we will have a mismatch of human resources. Now, for most of the higher diploma courses, over 90% of these programs are provided by the Vocational Training Institute, and the government does subsidize the VTC. So in our forthcoming initiatives, we will see what more we can do for vocational education. So we don't think that there will be a major impact on high dip programs. Now, some 3322 students with 3322 results, they will be affected, but the high dip programs are subsidized, so I don't think the effect is not that great. Now, I think the government should do a serious study to ensure that manpower needs are met. Next, Kin-yuen. Just now, members mentioned the issue of self-financing institutions. Earlier, I said that there has been adequate consultation throughout. However, on self-financing institutions, the ecology would be affected. Now, the Secretary just said that there should be a review of the positioning of roles. This should go ahead as quickly as possible, because otherwise there may be an effect on the ecology that may be reversible. Also, there are certain disappointments now on kindergarten education, we don't see a professional ladder. So this is disappointing, and there's no timetable, there's no plan. I don't know whether you can tell us whether you can start the work as quickly as possible on professional ladder for the kindergarten teachers, even though this is a complex issue. Now, on the new establishment, 0.1 plus 0.1, now some teachers are concerned that this doesn't really resolve the contract teachers issue. Now, can the government express its stance, how it will make use of these posts? Perhaps I will let the Secretary answer first. Now, on the salary scale of kindergarten teachers, we will try to embark on the investigation as quickly as possible, but there are many complex issues. Now, we've said that many times. There are issues like the school networks, and we have to discuss with the stakeholders. And we are now starting a new subsidies system. We have to let the effects show. So, and we extend the tide over grant because we need more time, and we will inform you of the outcome. Now 0.1 now for the 2,350 posts. Now we have told the principals and teachers very clearly that we hope that the schools will try to hire, will try to fill these posts primarily. Initial, at least, they will try to employ first those who employed to fill these permanent posts with the teachers who have already been teaching at the school, and we will try to study those cases where this cannot be done. Shu Ka-chun. I'd like to thank the chairperson that this has been a good discussion. Many of the members' questions are enlightening, so this is a very good mutual interaction. Now, I agree that the subsidy on self-funded institutions will have a major impact on the ecology. Now, right now the funding doesn't cover the 2-year sub-degree students. Now, and there's some uncertainty whether sub-degree or associate degrees will exist in the longer term. So some of my students studying under these programs feel a lot of uncertainty. They don't know whether the government would, in time, discontinue the sub-degrees. So I'd like to understand what is the government's position regarding the sub-degrees. Well, actually, the Secretary has responded to that many times. The Undersecretary. when we introduced the sub-degree or associate degrees, we said that we hope that this would be hopefully a valuable qualification, and we recognize the associate degrees as equivalent to other sub-degrees, and we want the associate degrees to continue to exist as a intermediate qualification leading to below the undergraduate degree, and there have been doubts in society on whether sub-degrees can achieve this goal, and this will be considered in our forthcoming review. We don't yet have a fixed stance on this, and in our documents we informed how people have been voicing certain opinions. It's not necessarily that we agree with them, but we think it's time to look at these views. Before the next member speaks, I'd like to say that we have received 4 motions. I will deal with them a little later. It's now already 6:25. There are 2 members yet to speak, and I have to deal with these motions. So I will extend the meeting. I can only use my prerogative to extend it by not more than 15 minutes. Helena Wong, I'm concerned about 2 things. Firstly, the CAP 320 Tertiary Institutions Ordinance and the Tertiary Institutions Regulations, CAP 320A. Now, these have been existing for over 20 years. Now, on the composition of the boards, now they are quite primitive. Now, they can get only the family members, for instance, to become the members to sit on the board, and there's very little transparency regarding the accounts and so on. So how do you ensure that the self-financing institutions are managed properly, and how the finances can be accountable? The government didn't say anything about that. Now, we want to help the students to attend the self-financing programs, but when they increase the school fees, do they have to get approval from the government? Now, after we pay the $30,000, they may increase the fees by the same amount. So what can the government do to make sure that these subsidies don't just go to enrich the operators of these institutions? This question has been asked just now. We will enter into agreement with these institutions who are subsidized. That is, if the fees increase not more than the consumer price index, they are allowed to, but if the increase exceeds that, they have to get permission from us. They have to provide the reasons. For instance, is it that the teacher salaries increase suddenly for that year, or whether is it that they have new ways to upgrade the teaching quality and more resources are needed. And on CAP 32A and 320A, now I mentioned earlier, when we review the positioning and roles of the tertiary institutions, we will certainly consider whether their current operation meets the requirements of their roles, we may adopt administrative measures or even legislate. We hope that this can be done as quickly as possible. Chen Chung Tai. Now, Annex 6 mentions in paragraph 6, it says that there would be
I'll read out from paragraph 16, student eligibility. The non-means tested annual subsidy of studies in Hong Kong and the mainland is only applicable to students A, attaining 3322 in the Hong Kong diploma for secondary education examination when they're enrolled in eligible self-financing undergraduate programs, or B, with sub-degree qualifications, i.e. after completing the relevant sub-degree programs when they're enrolled in eligible self-financing top-up degree programs. Does it mean that after students obtain the sub-degree qualifications when they're enrolled in eligible self-financed top-up degree programs, they can still be eligible for the $30,000 annual subsidy? That's correct. Well, let him answer. I mean, the understanding is correct because Dr. Chang Chung Tai just asked me. I can now ask Secretary to explain about Dr. Chang Chung Tai's understanding. Dr. Helena Wong, please don't interject. Please give me time, Ma'am Chair. This is very important. How much time do you need? I'll give you 1 minute. You're interjecting again. Thank you. I understand Dr. Zhang's concern and it's about the interpretation of this paragraph. But I want to emphasize that we're referring to local students who are eligible. Perhaps we haven't made it very clear in this paragraph that for sub-degree holders, they can obtain the subsidy when enrolled in the top-up degree programs. And for sub-degree holders, at the same time, they must also attain 3322 in the Hong Kong DSE. But I think that there is a difference here. When you are enrolled in sub-degree programs, some institutions allow a threshold of 250 marks for Chinese and 60 for English. And I am quoting this example, Hong Kong CT. That's the admission requirement. So does it mean that for sub-degree holders, they must be locals in order to get the $30,000 subsidy? Well, perhaps there is a different interpretation of this paragraph, but the emphasis is only local students will be eligible for the subsidy. If need be, we can elucidate on this point when we prepare the FC paper. That's it, Madam Chair. Members who wish to speak have spoken. So I'd like to ask members whether we support the administration's submission of this financial proposal to the Finance Committee. Noted. It is noted that some members would like to have this item put on the agenda of the Finance Committee as soon as possible. All right. Item 3, AOB. Yes, I'm dealing with it now. Yes. Next. Have you received this information? We have altogether 1, 2, 3, 4 motions. 4 motions.
好，咁呢就因為呢我哋人
We don't have many members here. Then the MM clerk has suggested that we ring the bell. How many members do we have? Ring the bell, please. would it be put up for separate voting in the FC? Definitely. Members, do we agree that in a moment we will spare the bell for all the 4 motions, so there won't be the ring of the bell, one motion after another? Mr. Shukachan, meanwhile, can you, well, since we have time, can you tell us what your motion is about? I'll read it out. At present, for underprivileged students at home, their computers are old and some students do not have the means to meet the basic needs of online learning and cannot cope with the present educational needs, and the government cannot provide sufficient IT support to take care of their needs. This panel urges the government to set up a subsidy for needy children to buy computers and to pay for internet expenses, and also on a reimbursement basis implement the policy so as to directly benefit the 330,000 underprivileged students and also be covered in the priority measures to provide quality education. Members, you should have in front of you motions that we're going to vote on. The first one is Mr. Shukachan, and please read through it. And just now Mr. Shukachan already read out his motion. After we vote on the first motion, we'll proceed to the second and the third one, both from Mr. Nathan Law, and lastly Mrs. Regina Ip's motion. Mr. Shukachan's motion. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Oh, I see a member holding up both hands. Any one objecting? Any abstention? One abstention. Next motion. Next motion from Mr. Nathan Law. Mr. Nathan Law, would you read it out? This panel urges the administration to conduct a more expensive public consultation considering how to use the outstanding recurrent funding for education to listen to the views of students and parents so that the administration can formulate plans that can directly help students. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Thank you. Those against, please raise your hands. Abstentions, raise your hands. I think that the motion is passed as well. Oh, Mr. Shukachan, I'm sorry. Just now, for the first motion, it's also passed. Third motion, also moved by Mr. Nathan Law. Mr. Law, please read out the motion. This panel urges the administration to strive to develop different academic and career ladders, including enhancing the acceptance of applied subjects, improving vocational training system, and increasing subsidized places in universities, review the positioning of self-financed institutions and UGC-funded institutions so that the education system can cater for the needs and different aspirations of students so that we have multiple pathways. Those in favor of Mr. Law's motion, please raise your hands. Those against, please. Anyone against? Okay, unanimously passed. So, Mr. Nathan Law's motion is passed. Mrs. Regina Ip, the last motion. Mrs. Ip, please. Please read it out. This panel proposes that the non-means tested subsidy for self-financed students should consider covering the higher diploma and sub-degree courses. Only for your consideration, Secretary. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Even Mr. Ho will support it. Has everyone raised their hands? Yes, that's what I saw. So I don't need to ask whether anyone is against the motion. So Mrs. Regina Ip's motion is also passed. Anything else on the AOB? If not, then meeting's adjourned. Thank you.